Welcome to episode 208 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Sterling Owen, who served in the FBI for 23 years. His first assignment was to the Jacksonville Division. Thereafter, he was transferred to the Chicago field office, and in 1981, he was transferred to the Knoxville Division. In this episode, Sterling Owen reviews the Butcher Bank failure case, his nearly 4-year investigation of Jake and C.H. Butcher Jr., who operated a multi-billion-dollar banking empire in Tennessee and Kentucky. The brothers, using a complex loan scam to steal millions of dollars from bank clients, led lives of wealth and power, and were eventually convicted of fraud and conspiracy, and each sentenced to 20 years in prison for their crimes. This white-collar crime investigation was designated major case status. Later in his career, Sterling Owen was promoted to supervisory special agent. Following retirement, he operated his own private investigation and security firm and served as a bankruptcy trustee in U.S. bankruptcy court until he was appointed by the mayor of the city of Knoxville to serve as their chief of police for 7 years. Sterling Owen has also held various positions with the local chapter and national office of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI. Currently, he is serving on the board of directors of the Knoxville Public Safety Foundation, which provides public safety officers with financial assistance. I love case reviews featuring financial crimes, so I hope you enjoy this one too. But before we get to the interview, I want to update you on what's going on with me. This is the last episode, suspenseful pause, I'll be posting from the South Jersey, Philadelphia area. The movers are coming next week and transporting all of my stuff, including my microphone and laptop, to my new home in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I will be closer to the grandbabies. I'm sad and I'm excited. But as far as you and me are concerned, I'm not going anywhere. I'll still be meeting you here every other week. Occasionally, I'll throw in a bonus episode. I also want to let those of you who have been waiting patiently for my next crime novel, Spoiled Sport, that it's going to be delayed. I'm trying to finish it, but between the pandemic, having my house on the market for 5 months, trying to sort through, toss out, and pack up 30 years of stuff, and then resettling in a new state, well, I think you can understand what's going on. But I did want to mention, because I think I forgot to, that the audiobook for Greedy Givers was finally published in mid-May. So for you podcast listeners who also like to listen to audiobooks, I now have 3 audiobooks available for you to enjoy. FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, Pay to Play, and Greedy Givers. And of course, these books are also available as ebooks and paperbacks. To learn more, check out the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. Remember, the only ad you'll ever hear on this show is me talking about my books. Thanks for the support. Of course, I want to welcome new listeners and invite you to join my reader team. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You can join my reader team on my website, or use the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Sterling Owen. Hi, Sterling.
Hello, how are you, Jerry?
I'm doing great. And before we say anything else, I have to give a shout out to your wonderful daughter, Carrie, who listens to the podcast and wrote me to let me know that her father was a retired agent and that she thought that you had an exciting case that would be perfect for the podcast. And then you and I got a chance to talk, and I agreed with her. So I am really excited to have you talk about the Butcher Bank failure. Where would you like to start?
Well, I'll start by addressing what you just said, and that is she has been my biggest supporter, and as a matter of fact, insisted that I do the podcast. So I agree with your thoughts, and I very much appreciate everything Carrie did. But I'm going to start really by my career in terms of coming to the Knoxville field office, which is where this case took place primarily. I was in the Chicago Division, and I was transferred in March of 1981 as a special agent accountant to prepare for the 1982 Knoxville World's Fair, which took place May 1 through October 31 of 1982. I initially was assigned a failed bank in La Follette, Tennessee, which is Campbell County, which is north of Knoxville, almost to the Kentucky state line. The bank was known as the C&C Bank of Campbell County and purportedly had total assets of $38 million. That bank had failed June 28 of 1980 and had been taken over by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to liquidate the assets and or sell the bank if possible, which is fairly typical when FDIC has to take over an institution. I was reassigned the case because the resident agency covering Campbell County did not have an agent with accounting skills, and I was the newbie in the Knoxville Division, had the SAA designation. And so I was reassigned the case there in March of 1981.
I have one basic question, and I think I need to ask this because there may be people who are listening who have no idea what it means when a bank fails.
Okay. When a bank fails, it means that usually, I'll use the typicals, usually the examiners, the people who insure your assets in the bank and or operate the bank, operate under certain rules. And FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is the one that usually you hear the most about. If you go into a bank, a lot of times you'll see a sign on the teller's window that'll say assets insured, or your deposits insured, or insured up to $100,000 or more, different things like that. So the FDIC insures a bank. Now, they have examiners like inspectors that come in to examine the bank ever so often. And they examine the deposits that have been made, the loans that have been made, how many of the loans have been repaid properly, how many of the loans are late being paid back, whether there needs to be additional capital or investments put into the bank, things like that. And so if they feel, and usually this is a long, protracted process, but if the examiners feel that the bank is weak in being able to protect the deposits of its customers, then they may conduct a real serious act called closing the bank. Now, what that means is that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation tells whatever state is involved, in my case, Tennessee, they go and tell the state examiners, we're going to close the bank because there's too high a risk and all the customers losing their money. And we as FDIC will pay back certain amounts of money to the customers. And so they withdraw their insurance coverage, which then causes the state banking commission to withdraw the certificate to operate. So by closing a bank, what they mean is the FDIC normally has told the state, in this case Tennessee, they need to close the bank because it's too weak to operate. Did I answer the question for you?
Absolutely. Thank you.
And when you close a bank, it can mean several things. It can mean that you found another bank to buy the assets of that bank and essentially take over operation. It can be that if you can't get anyone to buy the assets, which are loans and whatnot, you may just close it and liquidate. So there's several ways that you could go about closing a bank, or at least closing one institution, one corporation, and opening another. The La Follette, which is where the Campbell County Bank was located, La Follette, Tennessee, is approximately 40 miles north of Knoxville on I-75 as if you were driving to Kentucky. And so on a daily basis, that 40 miles, I drove up to La Follette and back at the end of the day while the case was underway. I quickly found out about the owner and president of the bank, Harry Vestal, Vestal, his brother and vice president, Tim Vestal, and their primary loan officer, Richard Smith, were the ones responsible for conducting the fraud that led to the bank being closed by FDIC. And by fraud, what I mean are loans that, and these are several examples, loans made to individuals without their knowledge, forged signatures, insider nominee loans, loans made with false justification or non-existent collateral, and other illegal transactions made by the bank owners or principals who were in position to control all the paperwork because, as I said, this is a relatively small bank with assets of $38 million. Now, when you get into some of the outlying counties in East Tennessee, and I'm sure many other places, it became interesting to investigate the case because of the loyalty of fellow Campbell Countyans who, even though they'd been victimized in the fraud scheme, were initially reluctant to cooperate in the investigation based upon their mistrust of the government. The bank officers were their friends and neighbors, and we were the feds. So when Campbell County, when I was starting to deal with some of the people that I had to go talk to as witnesses, I very quickly found out that one real serious issue was mining, where they were digging coal mines and whatnot, sometimes illegally. And so mining was a big deal as a vocation in some of these areas. So trying to even find some of the witnesses could be challenging. And I remember specifically one occasion when the location of a loan whose borrower's name had been used without his knowledge. He was located working on a mine, in a mine, someplace north of La Follette. So I worked on trying to get some information as to where I could find him, and ultimately figured out that he was working on a mine somewhere off of Stinking Creek Road. Now, that's a real road, and it has an exit off of I-75, but as you might expect, it's rather rural. So I had to go up to Stinking Creek Road and try to find this guy who was in a mining site without any real direction. So I'm driving down the road, and I look up and see a lady wearing a bonnet on the front porch of her home. I went up to talk to her, and as I started to ask her a question about who I was looking for, she immediately told me she didn't know where he was. So I could figure out quickly that she wasn't going to be real cooperative. But we talked for a while. And after a while, I figured out a possibility of a road. Now, at that time, being a new guy in the Knoxville Division, I had been assigned a 6-cylinder 1980 beige Plymouth Volare, which happened to be identical to the make, model, and color of the cars in the Office and of Surface Mining Inspectors Fleet. The Office of Surface and Mining was probably the most disliked organization in the county because they regulated and enforced mining operations. So I was immediately viewed as a mining inspector, even though I was wearing a coat and tie and not a uniform. But after what seemed like an eternity with a standoff and no one even acknowledging I was there, I saw where the front end loaders were scooping and then dumping dirt. So I drove my 1980 beige Plymouth Volare to a position where work had to stop. Then there was another standoff, and after a few minutes, my witness drove up in a pickup truck, pushed open the passenger door to expose his rifle in the passenger floorboard, and asked what I wanted. And after I told him he did not want to be interviewed, even though he was shown loan documents with his forged signature on it, suggesting he had gotten money that he did not receive. So when I suggested, after he refused to talk to me, that his reputation was one of being honest in his dealings with everyone, he shouted that that's absolutely true. And the reason he hadn't paid this loan is because he didn't get the proceeds.
And really, that's what you wanted to hear, wasn't it?
And I said, that's why I'm here, to talk to you for that very topic. But the ending to that conversation was he was cooperative. His information helped make the case. But he said to me as I was leaving that I might be worrying about the federal law, but he would take care of this particular situation involving himself with his Campbell County law. Now, fortunately, that did not happen. So I don't know what he exactly meant by that, but I could surmise.
So his initial reluctance to speak to you, was it based on the fact that they thought that you were a mining inspector, or was it still the loyalty to, his fellow, countymen?
Right. I think it was the latter. I don't think that he would really know enough to know which agency was dealing with different types of violations. But obviously, they thought I was a mining inspector to start. But I think it was his loyalty, and it probably was more so, Jerry, his reluctance to say or do anything against a fellow Campbell Countyan. That's my suspicion.
Interesting. I take it that you let him know right away that he was not going to be held responsible for paying that loan, that you realized that it was a fraud and that his name was used fraudulently. So I take it also that he didn't think he had anything to lose if he didn't cooperate.
Well, yes and no. I don't know that he thought of it in those terms. And you're right. I did tell him that I was satisfied he did not sign the promissory note and that he would not be responsible for it. But I don't know that he went into the depth that you did, given it thought as to what the end result would be. I think he just decided that his reputation was more important to him at that moment. And he wanted to make sure that I understood that he honored his debts.
Oh, that makes sense.
So as it turned out, remember I had mentioned earlier that Harry Vestal was one of the parties in this case and in this particular case. So as it turns out, in starting to do my investigation of Harry Vestal, he had previously been a part owner of some of the many banks that the Butcher brothers at one time had, and he traded his partial ownerships into several banks into a sole ownership of the C&C Bank of Campbell County, which was the bank that failed. Now, there was only one way he could really do that because he didn't have the money himself. So he had to borrow the money from the Butcher banks to buy the stock and or the partial ownerships. And by borrowing the money, of course, that meant that the banks now had control over the stock because it was the security for the loans. So it was like a cat chasing its tail. Yes, Harry Vestal was the owner. Yes, he told everybody that it was his bank. But the reality is, if he does not have control of his stock certificates, then really the butchers told him what to do whenever they needed to. Now, as time goes on, and I'm interviewing these different people and learning about these cases, I started to hear from the witnesses now. I don't know why you're doing this to Harry Vestal. He's not doing anything any different than the butchers. Now, bear in mind that I hadn't been in the Knoxville office very long, and I didn't really know who the butchers were. So as time went on, though, it became apparent that the citizens of Campbell County were correct. Now, how did I match the two up? Well, many of the suspect companies and or their principals became evident through the Campbell County Bank case because a lot of loans were being made to Jake Butcher, C.H. Butcher Jr., Jesse Bard, David Crabtree, other parties whose names started coming up over and over and over again, leading me to say, who are these people and why are they getting this much money? During the Campbell County Bank case, I was working with FDIC examiners, the ones I told you about that were coming in and looking at the bank. And they were very aggressive and knowledgeable. So we were quickly able to establish a rapport, and we became a mini task force, really, allowing for a smooth exchange of information. Where subpoenas were necessary, we got them, but if not, information was free flowing. And working at that point in time, it became apparent to me that the only way you would ever make a case on a group of the butcher banks was to take a snapshot of a particular day and follow all the transactions start to finish. Because what was happening was that as loans were made, and let's use numbers instead of names, but if loans were made from Bank A, and they were made to Party A, and the examiners came in and there were problems with that loan. They weren't able to make the payments. The collateral was fraudulent. In some cases, didn't even exist. So what would happen is they would take Bank A and that loan and sell it to Bank C, and the money would come back to Bank A and pay that loan off. So when the examiners came in and they're looking at that loan, and they start to say there might be something wrong with this. Boom, it's paid off. How'd they do that? They owned or controlled 27 banks of almost $2 billion that they were actually treating as their own checking accounts. And this is what made the case so difficult from the start. It was something where we are not dealing with a bank and looking at a transaction coming and going in the bank. We were looking at 27 banks acting as a bank, and where they were being used to move stuff around like a shell game.
I was just going to say that. It sounds like a shell game.
It really was. It really was. So I'm working the Campbell County Bank case, but I'm starting to look at the butcher banks and to look at, is this our next target? The Campbell County Bank was coming to a completion during the summer of '82 when the Knoxville World's Fair, which was driven, the head guy was Jake Butcher, was ongoing. So I did the typical thing we've all done as agents. I went into the office and started pulling file references in every case where either the Butcher brothers or other known associates were identified. Between the case references and the zero file references, and before you ask, zero file is miscellaneous information that did not rise to the level of being opened as a case, but we wanted to keep up with what was said. So a zero file, there were probably 40 in total over 3 or 4 years, but none had come to an active investigation, either due to a prosecutive declination or a lack of evidence. And you can imagine, though, me being in a conference room with push carts stacked high with case files. And remember, everything was in paper. back in the 80s. We didn't have electronics. And reading each case file or serial reference and putting together a summary memo with a white-collar crime supervisor in the SAC. When that was completed, which was near the end of the World's Fair, which remember was October 31. When it was completed, the supervisor, George Lambert, and I took the memo to our SAC, who was Doug Gow, and presented our position that based upon the evidence obtained in the Campbell County Bank case, the crimes committed that we were prepared to use at that trial, and general information gathered today, there was sufficient probable cause to open a case on Jake Butcher, C.H. Butcher Jr., and their 27 banks with assets of many billions of dollars. So literally, dozens of witnesses were interviewed in connection with the Campbell County Bank case, which again was feeding us information to help us understand what was going on. And you know, Jerry, one of the complaints that I heard often was the bank loaned me more money than I could pay back. Well, if you're like me and you hear that, it sounds more like an excuse on why you couldn't make your payments. But as it turns out, they were correct.
Oh,
and
really?
I will explain that here in just a minute. The World's Fair lasted from May 1 of 82 until November 1 of 82. The Butcher Bank case, which, believe it or not, I still remember the case number, KX29A 1397, which ultimately became Major Case 45, or code name Mayban, Mayban, which stood for Maynardville Bankers. Maynardville was the hometown of the Butcher brothers.
Okay.
And so we submitted the correlation memo to the SAC, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office joined in, agreed with us. And so we now had at least an idea of what kind of resources were going to be necessary to work a case of this size.
How long had you been in the Bureau at this time?
I had been in the Bureau 9 years.
Okay, so you weren't actually a new agent, but I would imagine that, you know, having started this smaller case with the Campbell County Bank, that you had no idea when you started that this was going to become not just a bank that was worth, you know, 38 million, but a number of banks now that were going into the billions of dollars. I mean, was that a surprise for you?
It certainly was not anticipated. I don't know how to put it other than, again, as one is working on a case, you get involved in the case and you become engrossed, and you sometimes don't sit back and look at as to what you think the end is going to be, but rather you're trying to make the case in the first place. But you're absolutely right. I had no idea that, and you, as this goes on, you'll see, had no idea that we were going to take a $38 million case, as you just put it, and you picked up on it quickly, a $38 million case, and all of a sudden it's taking down 27 banks worth several $billion. So just a little fella in the pond is taking down the whale.
Now it's denoted as a major case by FBI headquarters.
That's true. Being a street agent, I wasn't privy to some of the things that go on in making decisions and whatnot of what case becomes a major case and when you're entitled to additional resources and so forth. So what we did, I went with the SAC gal, with Supervisor Lambert and myself. We traveled to FBI headquarters and presented our request to the White Collar Crimes Unit, White Collar Crimes Section, and later to Division 6, to Assistant Director Oliver B. Buck Revelle. And based on SAC Gal's credibility, and he was extremely well liked and capable, and we like to think the merits of the case, that's the street guys talking, Jerry. A.D. Revelle approved the temporary transfer of 8 white-collar crime agents to the Knoxville Division, case funds, and sufficient support personnel to staff the case.
Wow, you're talking major if you're having all that additional manpower added to the case that initially was just you.
It was just me. And that was part of the argument of increasing our resources. Was it was a full-time job for me to work the C&C Bank of Campbell County. And there's no way with their $38 million, and there was no way that I could do without a lot of help to this forthcoming case. We got case funds to have an offsite, to rent, to purchase equipment. The Bureau was very good in terms of supporting the Knoxville Division and this particular case. You may ask, the offsite, why would you need an offsite for this? Well, first of all, the targets were very popular to many in Knoxville. They were seemingly very wealthy, highly recognized as politically powerful, and in the eyes of the general public were probably untouchable. Also, there were several Knoxville FBI field office support staff who were from the hometown of the Butchers. And while there were no concerns of their honesty or integrity, we just wanted to avoid any appearance of conflicts that might be brought out at a later point in time. So we moved our case and all of its files to an offsite. We also placed all of our professional support employees at the offsite. At the height of our case activity, at one time, we had 35 temporary data entry employees, 4 administrative personnel, 9 agents, the 8 transferred in plus me. We had IRS special agents, various visiting FBI personnel for all the other divisions that were affected. The Knoxville Division itself had a TSL of 62 agents, targeted staffing level. We knew this was going to be, and very quickly figured out, if we didn't know, this was going to be a big deal, because you're dealing with people who, as I'll share with you in a second, had run for governor, had been put in to be the finance director for the Democratic Party, national party, friends of Burt Lance, friends of Governor Jimmy Carter. I mean, these are not small town people. So as the old saying goes, if you're going to take a shot, it better be a head shot. Otherwise, you could have a very difficult time.
Yeah, these are very rich and powerful men. As you started to beef up your case, were you receiving any type of resistance or anybody trying? I know it wasn't going to work, but anybody trying to influence the investigation?
Early on, of course, most people did not know we were involved in an investigation. We were very selective in who we went out to try to talk to. And because we knew once the word got out that it would be no time at all, then we would be fighting with the media to try to speak to our own witnesses. So we were very selective in who we picked. To answer your question, no, we did not receive any pushback. We did receive, and I've seen this in other places, but we did see where people that we were talking to laughed when we started asking questions. And when we asked why, they said there is no way that anyone will have any success in investigating the Butchers. It isn't going to happen. And then after we did start investigating them, and it started making the front page of the paper on somewhat of a regular basis, and we had people following us to find our off-site location and things like that. But there was no attempt to affect our investigation. But everybody thought that they were too powerful, too rich, too politically powerful. And so as we started working the case, then it went to the grand jury, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I went to the grand jury, and of course the next thing is, well, you can present to the grand jury, but nothing's going to happen. Then after they were indicted and arrested, it was, well, they're never going to go to jail. They'll never be convicted. And then when they were getting their sentences a couple of years later, and most of them got 20-year sentences, it was like, see, they've stole all that money and they only got 20 years. So I guess that's something to expect.
You had a skeptical audience watching every move that you made. Well,
Once it got started, yes.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a quick question because you did mention the zero file. And of course, when I came in and where you were in, the zero file, like you said, was miscellaneous. So people had attempted, it sounded like, to complain about their behavior, to provide information about what the butchers were doing. But for some reason, no one ever gave enough that would predicate opening a case.
You're exactly right. Good observation. And oftentimes they couldn't give the details. The people that were part of the main scheme were people who were a part of the game. And so they weren't going to tell on anybody. The ones that got hurt the most were the ones, as I said earlier, that would say they loaned me more than I could pay back. What I mean by that, let's just say that Jerry Williams comes into one of their banks and says, I am going to start a new business and I'm going to sell lawnmowers. And so they would look at you and say, okay, how much do you want to borrow? Well, I want to borrow $50,000. Well, okay, let's look at this. You know, you're the only lawnmower sales place in your area. I think you're going to make a lot of money. And in fact, I'd like to be an investor. You say, well, that wasn't what I had in mind. And they say, well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to loan you $100,000. And you can have your $50,000 for the lawnmower. But then with the other 50, we're going to either buy stock in one of our banks, or you're going to buy an interest in other loans. And you can, with all of that, we're going to take half interest in your business. So you say, well, if I don't do this, I'm not going to get my loan. So what they do is they said, okay, not every case, but most cases. Well, by saying okay, that then made them liable for $100,000, not $50,000. And what the butchers would do would take the $50,000 and they'd work it through a series of stock transactions to create new money for them to go out and commit other fraud. And so all of a sudden comes time to start to make the payments and you can't make all those payments. And then they would come in and say, well, if you can't pay back what you borrowed, then, we're either going to have to foreclose on it or whatnot. Now, people would come in and they didn't have a lot of the background knowledge that I just shared with you because they weren't behind the scenes. All they knew was that they had borrowed $100,000 and they couldn't make all those payments. In other cases, similar type things. When was the last time you had a new car? I haven't had a new car and I don't know how long. And so he said, all right, if you haven't had a new car, why don't you get a new car on this loan too? And by getting a new car here, be the first one, be a start of a new business. You're going to have a nice car, blah, blah, blah. Now, instead of a $50,000 loan, you got a $100,000 loan to buy a $50,000 car. You can't make the payments. And so they would just feed you as much line as they could to get you hooked and then take advantage of people.
I'm trying to understand why they did it that way. I guess to hide the fact that they were getting these inside loans, but it also seemed that they almost they should have been able to anticipate that these loans were going to eventually fail. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Well, and you're talking about the borrowers. And what I'm saying is most of these people that they did this to were not educated people. And they took advantage of them. Back in the old days, there used to be 3 classes of people just about everybody thought were perfect. One was your preacher, one was your doctor, and one was your banker. And I know I grew up in a real small town, and one had really become successful when they were asked to serve on a board of a bank. And a lot of these people believed in what their bankers told them. In a minute, you'll hear me talking about they were actually signing promissory notes in blank and leaving them with their bankers, which were the butcher banks, of course. The theory being that when back in those days, it wasn't like an installment loan. They were using a 6-month loan, 180-day, or a year demand notes. So you borrowed money, and in a year, you owed the money back, or at least a payment on the money or interest on the money, things of this nature. And so these folks trusted without question their bankers. And when the bankers told them those stories, they just talked them right into being involved without wanting to be involved. As a matter of fact, one of the institutions that was not insured, in fact, it was the only institution that was not insured, what they did was paid a high interest rate. So they would pay a greater interest rate than everybody else was paying on deposits. Because it was not insured, as things wound on toward the end, guess who got stuck with not getting any of their money back? And these were a lot of people who, to them, were $50,000 or $100,000 represented their lifelong savings. And so the audience that the butchers went after were people who were not extremely well versed in business and certainly not in banking.
And these were the same people who looked up to them and who initially were loyal to them because they were from the same hometown and the same county.
You're absolutely right.
That's a shame. Really, it's really a shame.
Well, it was a shame. And if you were one of those borrowers and you did not know me or any of the FBI fellas from anybody, are you going to believe me, what I say, or are you going to believe somebody from your hometown that you've always looked up to and who came up with, well, it's always the feds. They're always trying to do something to take away something from us. It was heart-wrenching, frankly, Jerry, to talk to a lot of these people who lost everything. And as a matter of fact, many of them ended up having to file for bankruptcy because, if you'll recall, I told you that a lot of them had signed blank promissory notes. And the ones that signed the blank promissory notes means that when the butchers got to the point where they needed to turn cash over, they would use one of those blank notes, make it for $100,000, $200,000, $500,000, whatever they wanted to, and stuck that piece of paper in their files saying that the loan was justified because of this or that type of collateral. And of course, the person whose name was on the promissory note knew nothing about it, but it was their true signature. So as time went on and the case concluded, what we found out was the courts ruled that regardless of where the money went, if those were legitimate signatures, that borrower was responsible for that loan or for that particular note. And that just crushed a lot of people. I mean, think about it. If the bank had taken $1 million note to loan and they took the cash to buy anything from other assets or investments or cocaine, some of the players were into cocaine and whatnot. And here you are out operating your own business. And we come in and say, well, where's the $1 million you borrowed from the bank? And of course, you're going to say, what $1 million? And then you start working backwards. And the courts ruled that if a person had a legitimate signature on a promissory note, they were responsible for it, whether they got the proceeds or not.
Wow. That doesn't sound fair, does it? I guess it's legal.
But it's legal.
Yeah, but I don't know if it's fair,
Yeah. Believe me, we learned a lot about the court system. I mean, our usual things that we all were accustomed to working were put to the challenge when we worked this case, because we had some really smart bad guys who spent a lot of time trying to get around us or confuse us or prevent us from making a case. But the good news is these 8 agents that Assistant Director Ravel approved included some top-notch people who ultimately stayed here in Knoxville. They were not temporary. They were sent temporary, but they stayed here. And those were some guys some of your listeners may know and you may know. Gray Steed, Wayne Walls, and Bob Gibson came in from the Chicago division. Tom Palmer came in from the New York division. Jim Casper from Washington Field. Ed Velasco from Philadelphia. Bill Cole from Indianapolis. And Jim Wynn from New Agents Training, although his prior business experience had been in banking. And as you might expect, working this type of a banking case, he was invaluable. And again, I can't go over this enough times. We're still working with pencils and paper and adding machines. And as you might expect, the amount of paper generated from working this type of case, and we had literally between 300 and 400 separate cases that the 8 of us were working. It was a nightmare to keep the paperwork straight. We were fortunate. Back then we had accounting technicians. I think they have a new name for them now. But we got one that graduated from college with a degree in accounting, and we hired him as his first job. He came on board as accounting tech, and he was the one that kept up with all our paperwork. And I spoke to him on the phone the other day and told him I was going to be doing this and promised him I would say nice things about him. And if it hadn't been for him helping us keep the paperwork straight, we would probably still be at that offsite trying to get some things done.
You always know that you can depend on the support staff, and you're right. They never get the recognition that they deserve.
And they're there every day with us with everything that happened. You asked earlier about what did it mean to close a bank. And another situation that came into play in this case, which just further complicated things, was we had banks, butcher banks, some of the 27, that were insured by FDIC and regulated by FDIC. We had some banks from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. We had some banks from the Federal Reserve Board, all of whom had their own examiners, their own sets of rules, their own way of doing business. And they didn't even talk to each other most of the time, much less talking to us. But at some point in time prior to October 31 or November 1, the end of the World's Fair, they were together and put together a plan to go out and to examine their banks. Remember I told you earlier, the only way to really, that I could see to ever capture everything was to take a snapshot and then track everything that was happening. Because if you had a loan and you took a snapshot of it and you went in to do the examination and that loan was paid off, who paid it off? Where did that money go from? Where did the original money go to? And just take each loan that you could and put the package together. So we had 3 different regulatory bodies doing their thing up until November 1. World's Fair ends, and the rooms clear out from all the people that have been in Knoxville attending the World's Fair. And in March, 180 examiners. This is, if you're accustomed or have any background on bank examinations, most of the time, the number of people that come in are maybe 10, maybe 20. Depends on the size of the bank, obviously, but these banks I'm talking about. And for 180 people to come in here, it was almost like when Oak Ridge started working on the bomb. It of course, it went through the community, and it was national news. So,
could you talk a little bit about the cooperation between the examiners who are looking at a civil, matter, and the FBI and the IRS agents who are looking at this as a criminal matter? How did you cooperate? Because you're all looking at the same files and talking to some of the same people.
Good question. What we did was, of course, we started working as we normally would on a much smaller case. We had to issue subpoenas. And obviously, we were trying to dot every I and cross every T because of the people we were investigating. And we knew they would not be having someone who was unskilled as their attorney. So we mostly started working with subpoenas. If we had something we needed, we'd issue a subpoena, get the records back, and go from there. But very quickly, the United States Attorney and all the different parties, the FRB, the OCC, and the FDIC, they all put together a policy and a rule and a procedure which expedited things. And then we started working much closer together, sharing information. So that's how we overcame it. In the beginning, we were very cautious, and later we're able to work out arrangements that were legally suitable. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on the main players. Jake Butcher, he was in his mid-40s, was described by the media and others being a very handsome guy, well-spoken, well-dressed, charismatic, businessman who had married a Hollywood actress. He flaunted his wealth using a helicopter to commute from his mansion to work or to the Knoxville airport, where he had a $2 million jet available. He owned a 60-foot Hatteras, purchased it for $470,000. And it was named the Whirlaway, kept it in Florida with 2 luxury condominiums. Now, I used the dollar amount for that boat, $470,000, because later on we found out that a person's had a loan put in their name, an innocent party, for $470,000 that ultimately was used to buy this boat. And that other party didn't even know about it. And I'm also going to give you a story here in a second of a later contact with somebody on the Whirlaway. But Jake had farms in Georgia. His 1982 personal balance sheet listed $78 million in assets, $40 million in liabilities. He was seemingly financially and actually politically powerful. He had been an unsuccessful candidate for the governor of Tennessee in 1974 and again in 1978, and had served as an active member of the National Democratic Party. Plus, in conservative East Tennessee, and particularly his home county of Union County, his father's reputation of being the banker and one of our own was proof enough that the Butchers will take care of us. And we heard that over and over. His younger brother, C.H., or Cecil Hilke Butcher Jr., was a year younger than Jake, but generally thought of as being an astute businessman and street fighter. C.H. was reportedly a cocaine user, and he enjoyed partying at any opportunity. Jake would handle the vision and a big picture and then turn it over to C.H. to put the deal together, and then back to Jake to be the face of the deal and the closer. In one capacity or another, they were very charitable and active in the community. Jake was someone, and these are all things that over time we heard, Jake was someone who would put his arm around you, and C.H. would slap you on the back. There was an air of competition in that Jake had several banks under the name United American Banks. C.H. had several banks under the name City and County or C&C Banks, but they were very loyal to each other. As a matter of fact, at one point in time, C.H. bought his wife a $165,000 Rolls Royce Cornish. He listed his assets at $105 million. Jake's principal offices were in a 27-story bank building owned partly by C.H. They employed retired local and federal law enforcement in security positions. Jake became the leader in bringing the 1982 World's Fair to Knoxville, although using their 27 banks was the only way he could finance it, and many of those loans later went into default. By 1982, Jake and C.H., 27 banks, were responsible for over 50% of the commercial loans in Knoxville. 50%
Wow.
of the commercial loans in Knoxville. In other words, everyone knew who the Butchers were.
Right. And everybody who had a loan with them also felt an allegiance to them and a loyalty to them.
Correct.
They bought themselves legitimacy.
Yeah, they did.
It's just amazing to me. I just have to say this. In my mind, I'm thinking, what kind of a person are you that has such a high profile, in the community, in the state? Because, I mean, he ran for governor twice. What kind of a person are you that can do this knowing that it's all a lie, that your wealth and that your prestige, everything that you're putting forward is all fake, and that you've basically been stealing from your clients and your bank in order to put you on this pedestal, to be the foundation for everything that you do, and it's all based on criminal behavior. It's amazing to me that people can sleep at night knowing this.
I'm sure you've heard the term power corrupts.
Yes, absolutely.
And your questions were extremely on point. And as time went on, we went to trial or got to the trial phase. In my personal conversations with Jake Butcher, but when I asked him how he thought he was going to get away with this, because sooner or later, unless you're printing money, you can't keep up with how much you have to keep in the system. It's like, as a matter of fact, for those who know the term check kiting, it's a process where you put in a check for $10, and then when it comes around, you don't have the $10. You make a deposit for $15 to cover the 10. Then you have to do one for 20 to cover the 15.
Right. You're taking advantage of the float.
Taking advantage of the float. And that's exactly what this was. This was a loan kiting process.
At a major scale.
Oh, unbelievable.
I'm always fascinated with white collar crime more than I am with, drug investigation and organized crime. This is an exact example of why it fascinates me so much, because of the mentality that you have to have when you're a drug dealer or, organized crime. People can see your viciousness and the criminal nature, but when you're a white collar criminal like the Butchers, that's all internal. And I can't understand how it doesn't eat a person up inside to be carrying this false identity.
Your point is well made, and I could only answer that by saying, when I talk to Jake at times afterwards and ask him, how do you expect to keep this float, or how did you expect to keep the float going? It was a situation where he said, well, I was going to pay it back. Now, how many times have we heard, as we used to say, the Tilly the Teller cases? I took $20 out of my cash drawer until Friday on payday, and I was going to put it back. And of course, it never happened. And it was impossible for him to do it. But in his mind, and one of the arguments that he put forward through his attorney was that, hey, I, Jake Butcher, or I, C.H. Butcher Jr., we're the ones that really lost in all this. We lost the value of all of our stock, that hundreds of millions of dollars I talked about a while ago in their balance sheets. These stocks are now worth nothing. Do you think we would have intentionally bankrupt ourselves? Well, let's look at this. Well, you use people's names, you use forged collateral, you use make-believe collateral, you lied, you stole, you did everything. You tell me. How exactly did you expect to keep it going? And of course, there is no answer to that. I use the term power corrupts because they actually got to the point where they could do these things because of their seeming power, both financially and politically. And so they were able to get a lot of things done that you or I could never do. But they could do it because they were signing on both ends of the ledger. They got away with it until 1983, and things then started changing. Jake had a confidant, and his principal advisor was a fellow named Jesse Barr, B-A-R-R. Jesse had been a banker in Memphis, Tennessee with the Union Planters Bank until he was convicted of bank fraud down there. But that conviction didn't prohibit him from being an employee of the United American Bank, which was Jake's bank. He could not be an employee because he was a felon, but he could be a contractor of someone who had a contract with the bank. So they spent a lot of time trying to figure out, how do we keep him involved without him being an employee of the bank. And that's what they did. They entered into a contract with his wife to renovate branches of the bank. And then she got paid $100,000 a year. And then she in turn hired her husband, paid him $1 a year, literally. And it was this big deal publicly when this happened every year. She'd pay $1 because he had all these judgments against him from the prior bank fraud at Union Planters in Memphis. So the civil judgments were waiting on him to collect some money to take away from him. So they had a big deal every year, and he'd get his $1. And they'd have the bank's attorneys come in, they would do a deposition and so forth. I mean, everybody knew what they were doing, but they felt there were enough loopholes that they didn't want to pursue it. Well, we pursued it. And as a matter of fact, Jesse Barr, a very personable guy, very personable. Everybody laughed at him and liked him and whatnot. And he was just a crook. And when I'd go up to do interviews and whatnot in the bank, their sixth floor of the building was the executive floor. And as I'd walk through going to wherever I was going, and now this is before, obviously, the bank closed, but when I was up there investigating, and I'd hear all these pages, Jesse Barr, line 6, Jesse Barr, line 2, all this kind of stuff. So when I finally interviewed Jesse, I said, where's your office here? Well, it's down at so-and-so. And I said, well, what do you do for the bank? He said, oh, I don't work for the bank. And I said, Jesse, you get more pages for telephone calls than Jake Butcher gets. And as it turns out, well, number one, it was true. But number two, Jesse kept up with all the phony loans that Jake was operating in his multitude of companies, both real and imagined. And C.H., the younger brother, his equivalent to a Jesse Barr was a fellow named David Crabtree. David Crabtree was a certified public accountant, and many people said he was a financial genius. They would come up with different plans to create some company, real or imagined, to loan money to use that money to either pay off some of these other phony loans that were out there or to create new deals. David was a wannabe. He wanted people to think he was a really sharp guy and had a lot of money, and he did, but he was operating off everybody else's money, of course. But he would fly in a helicopter. Now, this is in a regular subdivision, and he would fly back and forth sometimes in a helicopter and land on a street in a subdivision near his home so he could come and go to work. I mean, they were just that arrogant.
Nice commute.
And of course, if you're not paying for it, you're using somebody else's money, not bad at all. And as the investigation began, the strategy was typical. And we were going to, our normal case, we thought we were going to have to start going after the lower level participants, start to prosecute them, put pressure on them to give up who was telling them what to do. But once we got started and became more cooperative with the FDIC and we identified witnesses who would cooperate, we were able to expedite a lot of our cases and go straight to Jake, C.H., and the people who were literally getting the money. And that's what we were looking for, Jerry. We were looking for not a secretary that was told to sign a sheet of paper saying it was May 25th instead of June 25th. They weren't getting anything for it. We would go in, and once we found out who told them to sign that paper and where the money went from the signature on that paper, and the person that got the money were the people we were going after. At one point in time, we had 312 separate cases totaling $374 million in play, just in fraud cases. Now, what do I mean by fraud cases? Well, I'll give you some examples. Signed but not completed promissory notes. And again, go back to the way it was back in the 80s. And you would go in and sign a note, and if the banks was willing to do it, of course, you might sign a 12-month note. What that means is at the end of 12 months, you either had to pay it off or pay on it, but you had to pay the interest. So some of the examples of those would be false information that was going on those 12-month notes, such as the collateral. We had a lot of the notes that were being created. And if you're looking in the bank file and you say, okay, that this note was made a year ago, and yet at the end of the year, there was an interest payment made on it and everything looks good. They renewed it for another year. That's not something that might raise your concern. But if that note had been paid off by another similar type note, which was paid off by another similar type note, it'd be good to know that. And because the bank was showing income, because each time they would have one of these false notes, part of that money would go to interest. The interest was being recorded on the bank's books as income. So you think that the bank is making a lot of money. But the reality is the bank just keeps making more notes at a higher dollar amount to someone to keep paying off the lower amount notes.
Almost sounds like a Ponzi scheme.
Well, a Ponzi scheme or, as I said earlier, it's a loan scam. Think about it. How would you like to try to keep up with several hundred of these notes in different people's names? We had proceeds going to different people. We had fraudulent collateral, stolen bearer bonds. We had bearer bond coupons. And, of course, they don't even have bearer bonds anymore. Back in those days, they did. They stole the coin and put them in drums and then hid them underneath fertilizer bags on a farm of theirs. They're worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If it was available to be stolen, they'd figure out a way to steal it.
The greed.
Oh, yeah. They had no throttle. There was no governor on their behavior. I guess many of these acts in and of themselves might not have been unprecedented. Some of these were not creative fraud. But what made the case so difficult was that you had 27 banks, 27 sets of documents, and oftentimes these documents were being moved bank to bank, and it was just keeping up with it and being able to present it to a grand jury and ultimately to a jury, of course, was something we had to bear in mind every minute of every day. We're not just playing to create paperwork here. We're trying to convict people who are stealing.
What's interesting is that, you're taking this to a grand jury and you have to first explain why it's a crime. If a bank's been robbed, you can just go to somebody and say, hey, the bank's been robbed and this is the guy that we said did it. But when you're a white collar crime investigator, and in your case, going in with all of your accounting knowledge, now you got to break it down so that the jurors can understand, first of all, what in the world happened? What is the crime? What did they do and how did they do it? And then once you establish that, then you still had to convince them that it was a crime and that the butchers were the people who were responsible. It's so complex and complicated.
What we found worked the best with our jurors, and particularly most of our jurors were, again, not sophisticated individuals. And so what we found worked best were charts. As we were presenting things to the grand jury, I broke it down into specific loans. And I tried to make it as simple as possible, but we had just the old time magic marker on a chart saying, here's the first place this loan showed up. And the money was supposed to go to Jerry, but it went to Sterling Owen instead. And then the money came from someone else, and it came in and paid off Jerry's loan, but then they got a new loan in somebody else's name. And so you end up with just chart after chart, but we tried to keep them to where they were only on a specific loan or combination of loans if it involved more than one. So that's what we did in the grand jury. Now, as far as what makes it a federal crime, some of them are easier to explain than others, obviously. If we had a transaction and it had your name on it as the borrower, but the money went to me, that's a little easier to say. You don't have to know Title 18, Section 2311 that it affects so-and-so. You don't have to say that because everybody understands. If I'm on the hook for this loan, the money didn't go to me, something wrong with that. So what we did was we just tried to simplify it as much as we could. What we found out was that Jake Butcher had Jesse Barr trying to be his executive assistant, and C.H. Butcher Jr. had David Crabtree being his executive assistant, trying to keep up with all these different loans going in all these different directions for all these different purposes. Jesse Barr once made the statement after everything was going downhill for them. And when I asked him, I said, what type of management style would you call this? And he said, oh, there's no question. Our business model was management by crisis. Which loan do I have to take care of to get myself through today?
And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about how you can mentally go through all of that internal crisis and chaos that goes along with pulling off a scam.
Yeah. Well, they reached a point where I don't think they even thought about being a violation of the law or not. I think it became just a challenge to them to try to keep all the balls in the air. It was a nightmare for us, and we were straightening it out. They didn't have a clue a lot of times as to what had really happened in a given transaction, because they were so busy keeping the money moving that they didn't have time to sit down and think about it. It was just what gets us through today. And a couple of things just kind of interesting, I thought. One is you might say, well, how did they get away with this for all these years when the FDIC or other regulatory bodies were coming in and doing their examinations? And part of it, we were told, never could prove, but was that they were being tipped off when the FDIC examiners were coming in to do an audit. And also that they had been tipped off by reservation clerks at the hotels near the banks when examiners came in, because they always booked their rooms at FDIC government rates. So the reservation clerks figured that out pretty quick, that if we got that, we better tell the butchers or whoever was in charge of that particular bank, we better tell them that the examiners are here. So there were lots of things going on around us that we never could prove, but at least it was alleged. One other thing that I wanted to mention was during the course of the investigation, we ended up, now the banks are closed. Let me set the scene here. The banks have been closed by the regulatory bodies. The butchers have moved out of the banks. Jake Butcher has moved into his 18,000 square foot mansion where he's got all these records now and he's operating out of. But he's also taken official bank records. So we got a search warrant for his house and went out there and executed the search warrant. He was out of town, as was his wife. And so when we arrived, most of the house was locked, except one of the agents found the front door to be unlocked. So we didn't even have to force entry. The business wing of the house had a number of file cabinets, which turned out to be, in some cases, original. Now that was significant. Original bank loan documents involving a number of fraudulent loans. So as the search progressed, I randomly selected 3 file cabinets against a wall to search. And all were locked. So we had a tech guy there. And he came in and immediately picked 2 of the locks. And we were in the process of getting ready to drill the 3rd cabinet when I received word that the assistant U.S. attorney who was overseeing the search was not in the room, but he wanted me on the telephone. So I went in and answered the phone. He said he had provided a courtesy call to Jake's counsel announcing the search after it was started. And the attorney said that there were 3 cabinets, file cabinets against one wall containing attorney-client records. All the rest were open for search. So I responded to the AUSA. I was personally searching those cabinets. And so far, there was nothing found as attorney-client except a fee letter on how much they were going to charge for representing. And in fact, what I had found were a number of original bank loan documents at Jake's house in that file cabinet.
Wow. And do you think the attorney was aware of all of this? those alleged attorney-client records would have disappeared at some point.
Well, one can suspect.
Wow.
But after we say the pregnant pause, the AUSA said to me, keep going with the search. And I think he was shocked about this defense attorney, whether he was intentionally or unintentionally misleading somebody. But what I know is what was there. And the other thing, in one of these same file cabinets, in Jake Butcher's attorney's handwriting, were worksheets where he had gone through and calculated who was going to be able to deduct on their income tax return interest that was being paid on these phony loans and everything that were being created. So they were actually creating a phony loan, generating phony interest, generating yet another phony loan to pay off the first phony loan. And then they were taking that interest and assigning it to different of the main players to deduct on their individual tax returns. When I found that particular document and all the handwritten information, I called the IRS agent over who had been working with us and, of course, was a good guy. And I said, this should make your day. And we later showed that it was Jake's attorney's handwriting on it. And he was convicted of fraud for what he had done, too, because they were stealing every way there was to steal.
Okay, so the bank and the principals have an attorney. Didn't they also have financial people and auditors working for the bank?
They did not have, other than just some internal people, they did not have an auditing department as you
What? For a bank? Oh, that tells you right there, how fraudulent these 27 banks were, that they did not even have their own internal auditing.
And the ones who supposedly filled a role similar to that were stooges. I mean, they were not there to really do anything. They didn't want them to find anything. So if anything, they just had a title. There's a couple of things I did want to mention. I wanted to give the FBI laboratory credit. We sent the paperwork, the original paperwork. It was an option to purchase a Howard Johnson hotel in Knoxville. This was the option agreement. And the option was dated a certain date. We had the original document, and it was being treated as collateral. So they had this option in the file saying, okay, we've made a loan for, I don't remember how much it was now, but several $100,000. And the loan is being secured by this option to purchase a hotel. Now, the document was dated to fit the circumstances surrounding this phony loan. I call it phony loan now because we sent it to the lab and said, we're not sure what you can do, if anything, but help us out here. And the lab was able to determine that the ink that signed the document on the date that was reported on the document was not even created or manufactured until a year later.
Wow.
Now, you talk about some strong evidence. Is the option any good? I don't think so. The ink on it wasn't even manufactured for a year after the document's dated. So that was really one of the neat things that the laboratory did to help us. Another is, I don't know if you're familiar with the bearer bond or not, but a bearer bond is about the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, usually on a little heavier bond paper. And at the bottom of it, it did not have anybody's name on it. It had a serial number, but by being a bearer bond, whoever had it, it was theirs. And in the bottom of it, they had coupons. You probably heard over the years somebody saying, well, I'm retired and I'm going to clip coupons for the rest of my life. Well, what that means is on the bottom of, in this case, a bearer bond, there were outlined little, looked like sheets of paper. It was all part of the bond, but it was a small coupon size. And what you would do is each one of these coupons on the bottom had a date as to when that particular coupon expired. I shouldn't say expired, when it became able to cash it. So if you had a bearer bond or you had some of these coupons, you could actually treat those just like cash. Well, think of it, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Down at the bottom, you had a bunch of maybe 1 inch by 3 inch coupons, and you just took a pair of scissors and cut it off as it matured. Well, think about how many of these we had all over the country. These are federal bearer bonds. And I mean, who knows how many. But I started tracking where these bearer bonds go once they're negotiated. And C.H. Butcher Jr., who was alleged to have had some of these coupons, gave a statement in front of his attorney that he had never seen a coupon, he'd never touched a coupon, didn't know anything about coupons. So we went back to Treasury through the Washington field office as a lead, went back to Treasury and asked them, would you tell us what happens to these coupons after they're negotiated? And so they did. We got them some serial numbers that we were able to track from other bank records, set them up there. And I want you to know, whoever did it, I don't know who, but whoever did it went down there through, it's got to be thousands of these things. Now, they had ways of tracking them somewhat, but for the most part, you're in bags of little coupons. They found the ones we were looking for, and we sent them to the lab. And the lab found C.H. Butcher Jr.'s fingerprints on a coupon.
The coupon that he knew nothing about.
He knew nothing about. And that was one of the key features down the road that caused him to go ahead and plead guilty. And another one that I really liked, little side notes, was it was kind of seemed to be a game with them of creating new collateral or creating some means of a security that they could use to justify making a loan. That was the key. They needed the money. The only way they could get the money was to get it out through a loan to give the impression it was legit. But most of it was not legit. They were looking for more collateral, and David Crabtree, the guru for CH, he included air rights, AIR rights, as collateral on that case. And I have to admit, I said, what is an air right? And what he was doing, they were trying to get money. So they decided they were going to build a 29-story office building to be the flagship property for the CNC bank chain. And so to get cash to do not only building the building, but also for all their other shenanigans, what they did was they created air rights. So they went to their insiders and they said, okay, you're going to buy 5th floor and the 8th floor of like condos, and you're going to pay us $3 million, and I'm being hypothetical with the numbers. You're going to pay us $3 million to have the opportunity to buy the 5th floor and the 8th floor. Now, when down the road, had we not stopped the transaction, had it gone to fruition, I'm sure there'd been another series of fraudulent transactions and additional collateral to back up more loans to pay off the first group of loans. And I'd never heard of air rights before. Now, I understand that they're in play now, but this was back in the early 80s. And so I thought it was pretty creative, frankly. But it wasn't legal, but it was creative. One of the others that you may like, we subpoenaed the CPA's records to the non-insured financial institution that was in play as part of the 27 banks/thrifts. The CPA came in from Memphis, and the night before he was to testify in the grand jury at a hotel where he was staying, which is next door to the Tennessee Highway Patrol Station, he woke up in the morning ready to go to the grand jury, but someone had broken into his car during the night and stole his work papers. Now,
oh my!
For someone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, that would be like having a 6-inch to a foot-high stack of papers. And they're the most boring and unlikely items anybody would want. But he was smart enough to report to the police, and the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't prosecute at the time because he just couldn't get the evidence to do something. we never saw the records, the work papers and so forth for that particular break-in. But think about it. Break into a car to steal work papers? Call me cynical.
So you're going to tell me that based on all this evidence, they all just pled guilty and that you didn't have to bother with any type of trials?
We had one trial early on that we lost for CH, which was on, as our AUSA said, a creative charge. It didn't work very well. But all of our others, they pled guilty to everything. And
CH, did he get away with it then?
He got away with that one charge, but we got him for 20 years on many others. And we had different jurisdictions, different judicial districts that had charges as well, because they had banks around the state of Tennessee, banks around the state of Kentucky. So you had Eastern District of Tennessee and Middle District of Tennessee. All of them were having charges going at the same time. And so, no one got away with it. He did get acquitted on that one transaction. What they tried to do was charge with a wire fraud on a TV commercial advertising one of the thrift savings businesses, the small one. And they said people in Kentucky saw the TV advertising, which made it interstate. They tried to charge them with a wire fraud. And the jury did not buy that argument. But all the rest of them, all the bank fraud that we've been talking about here, wire fraud, we had bankruptcy fraud, which is something I want to be sure and mention to you. If someone's listening to this and are working white collar and stuff, don't ever forget about the importance of a bankruptcy trustee. If you have someone who files for bankruptcy and is also involved in a criminal investigation and or is put into involuntary bankruptcy, there's a number of things that can be done in bankruptcy court to force the disclosure or the taking of a Fifth Amendment to get information to help your criminal case and or your civil case, depending on which way you're looking at it. It is bankruptcy trustees, and I served as one for a period of time, have a lot of leeway when someone's trying to snooker somebody else out of money that they're hiding and so forth. If someone's working a financial fraud case, and if there's any bankruptcy involved, the U.S. trustee's office and or the bankruptcy trustee for that particular case early on, and they may be of a great deal of assistance down the road.
So Jake and C.H. Butcher each got, did you say 20 years?
20 years. Jesse Barr got, I think, 20 years. David Crabtree got 18 years, I believe. Those were the main players. We had a total of 26 people indicted: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, bankruptcy fraud, income tax. We ranged from 3 years to lower level people to 20 years. At this point in time, there's only one of the main players that's still alive. Everyone else has passed away.
And how long did this entire investigation last from when you first started to the last person who was sentenced?
It started, I would put it middle of 82, and probably I would say to 86 with all the hearings and the appeals and everything. So probably middle of 86. So 4 years.
Almost 4 years. Wow. That's that's a dedication to a case, definitely. Job well done.
Well, thank you. And again, that's why I wanted to mention everybody's name in the very beginning that were part of it. You've had the cases where you feel like you're really helping someone, and we felt that way in this case because there were so many people who had been taken advantage of, and if we weren't there to help them, they weren't going to be helped. And it's still, there were a lot of them that lost a lot of money and whatnot. And I know they were disappointed in the people that they felt like were their friends. But at the same time, they at least received some good feeling about the fact that, yeah, we lost some money, but at least somebody went to jail for stealing from us.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to, at this point, talk a little bit about you and your career. When did you join the FBI, and why did you join the FBI?
I joined the FBI November 20th of 1972 was my EOD date. Why? I was recruited because I had an accounting degree, I was working for a CPA firm in my small town of Cynthiana, Kentucky. And I worked for the CPA firm, and I was a part-time police officer just because I liked doing it. And, we'd come out and help when there was a fair and stuff like that. It wasn't any real police work. But because I had a college degree, it was in accounting, there was a desire to get people with accounting experience in the bureau, probably long-term to work cases like this. And so I was recruited by an FBI agent who would come in and help the part-time policeman qualify with a revolver and defensive tactics and so forth. And so he started recruiting me, and then he got transferred, and a second guy came in and completed the process of recruiting me, and I was selected in 72. Fast forward a little bit, if you will, and probably 2 or 3 years ago, the first guy that started recruiting me transferred, retired, came back to Lexington, Kentucky to live. The second guy who finished recruiting me completed everything, retired, and moved to Greenville, Tennessee, which is a short distance from Knoxville. And then I came back to Knoxville. So I picked up the Greenville, Tennessee retired agent, and we drove to Lexington one time to the Lexington chapter for the RA and had lunch up there. And they brought in the first guy that recruited me. He was 93 at that time. So he came in, and we were able to have a little get together of me, and then Bob Bird from Greenville and Clyde Graven from Lexington. And it was kind of neat to see everybody who took a part in my recruiting.
That's a nice story. Very nice story. You worked this case midway through your career. Did you spend all the rest of that time in the Knoxville Division?
Yes. My first office was Jacksonville. I was there from early 73 after I'd completed training academy, and was until 78. I went to Chicago, was in Chicago from 78 to 81, came to Knoxville, and then stayed in the Knoxville Division the remainder of my career. I was selected to be a supervisor in 1990, retired in 1995. I had a private investigation firm for 9 years. I was very fortunate in 2004 to be selected by the then mayor of Knoxville to become the chief of police for the Knoxville Police Department. And while I had met a variety of the officers, you really didn't get involved into the weeds, so to speak, about the operations of a department and what the people go through. I headed up the Civil Rights Squad for the FBI before I left the FBI. And also had served on a citizens group to oversee allegations of misconduct by the police department on behalf of the citizens of our community. So I served in some positions that I really didn't think were the best to be following up as becoming a member of the police department. But I was entirely wrong. I was 100% wrong. What I found is occasionally someone does something they should not do. But what the police officers go through on a daily basis is incredible. And we work really hard to have training for a variety of things, even to the point of, if you see this type of conduct by someone, it doesn't automatically mean that they're drunk. They may be having a medical condition and whatnot. And we taught some of our recruits, or all the recruits through their recruit basic classes, taught them to be aware that everything is not as always as it seems. And we brought doctors in to talk about these things. And I found the policemen to be just as dedicated to their job as FBI agents are to theirs or anyone else is. They wanted to be recognized that they're trying to do the right thing. And we had a great police department, and for 7 years, I learned a lot. And one of the things I learned was how much the FBI had taught me. And I was able to take that and carry it over to the police department. And I think most of the officers feel that we had a good team going, and it worked well. I really enjoyed it. When the mayor left to become governor, I left the police department, and they've continued on quite well without me. And then I was a receiver in federal court on a financial civil case for 3 to 4 years. But I am totally retired now, except when I talk to Jerry Williams.
Well, I know that you've also done volunteer work, and that one of the things that you've been a part of that you're not mentioning is the Public Safety Foundation. Could you tell us more about the work that you've done with them?
A little birdie must have told you that.
Oh, what are you talking about? Everybody knows about your work with the Knoxville Public Safety Foundation.
Well, thank you. In 2011, we actually put together a foundation for the police department, fire department, UT, University of Tennessee Police Department, and the Knox County, our local county sheriff's department. And we started collecting money, as most foundations do. It's a 501c3. We got it all put together. The little different twist for ours is we invited the policemen and firemen to themselves become a member by payroll deduction for $100 a year. So it's $3.85 a payday. And a lot of our policemen, firemen, sheriff deputies, and so forth, UTPD people, all have joined. And so it's kind of a self-sustaining foundation from just the members. And it always is nice when I have to go out or need to go out and talk to a business person about making a donation. And you say, by the way, we have this many policemen and firemen that would be beneficiaries of a grant if they needed it, but they are also members of, and that money goes into the kitty to help take care of each other. So it has worked out real well. We have over $300,000 now, and we just gave an award the other day to someone who had a terrible situation, medical situation for a child. And that's what we try to take care of, non-reimbursed or situations that are not covered by insurance, that type of thing. We try to help out if it's a crisis.
I understand that you've also done some work with the Society of Former Special Agents Foundation.
Well, I did. I served on as a trustee on the board for the foundation, the Society of Former Special Agents Foundation, and for 2 years served as the chairman of that committee. But again, top-notch people on the board of trustees, and then Nancy Savage is the executive director for the society and kind of helps oversee the foundation as well as society business. And that was incredibly rewarding as well to help former agents that had a time of need.
Excellent. Well, I always like to give my guest the last word. What would you like to say?
The Bureau, while we've taken some lumps in recent years, but they still continue to do outstanding work. So I want to encourage our young people who are eligible to come into the FBI. If it's something they have any desire to do at all, please do it. It was a wonderful career. Everything that I accomplished was because of my time with the Bureau and the training we received and the people that we became acquainted with and worked with, and many are still my friends. It's a wonderful organization. So if anybody's looking for a position out there and wants to help do good, look at the possibility of becoming an FBI agent.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Sterling Owen. There are links to newspaper articles about the Butcher Brothers bank failure. There's a link to a news video about the Butcher Brothers with a cameo from Sterling Owen. And he also gave me a group photo of many of the agents who worked on this case. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.